So I've cleaned up the flywheel, gotten rid of the oil and other contaminants that were on it, and I use a little AutoSol metal polish to just brighten it up a little bit. And then where the teeth that I found had a couple of nicks in them, I use a little triangle file and just clean up the edge and then clean off any burr on the backside that was caused by the starter motor. Now on these tabs on the flywheel are the timing marks. This one has the OT or top dead center and the S or the firing mark, which is where you time the ignition. And then the Z mark on this one is full advance. What I like to do is paint them. I usually use a little yellow on the OT, a little white on the S, and then red on the Z. It's a lot easier to see them than if they've got paint colors on them when you're trying to time the engine or find top dead center. So I have a little yellow in the OT scribed timing mark, a little white in the S, and a little red in the Z, which is the full advance mark. The way I do that is I take a little tester's paint and use a toothpick and kind of fill it in a little. And then I let it dry and take some 4-0 or 4-aught steel wool and just clean it off. And that always leaves a little bit of paint behind in the scribe line. So these are a lot easier to see when you're using a timing light. So I'm going to clean up the guide ring, and there's a O-ring which fits around the crankshaft nose to seal it. So I'm just going to pull that out. Then I'm going to use metal polish on this ring and get rid of the discoloration. And I'm running my fingernail across the groove, and I really don't feel much of a ridge. Very, very, very slight. So then what I'll do is take some 1000 grit wet dry paper and then 1500 grit wet dry paper and polish this mating surface on the guide ring up. Now I've applied some metal polish to the ring to clean it up, and it's pulling quite a lot of garbage off it, so I'll continue doing that. So this is the guide ring after I've used the metal polish on it, and it's looking pretty nice. So next is to get rid of the groove. So I finished working on polishing this face of the guide ring, and I actually had to go to 600 grit paper and then 1000 and then 1500. And what I do is take my fingernail and run it across the groove, and you can see there's still a groove in this, but it doesn't catch my nail. So it's very, very minor and should not affect the ability of the rear main seal to create an oil-tight seal against the guide ring. So I cleaned up the face. There are some places here where there were some spots of rust, but I've got that cleaned up. And of course, those were the 2 punch marks I put into it to be sure everything goes back together with the right orientation of flywheel and crankshaft. And I cleaned up the inside here. So the guide ring is all ready to be reused again. So I'm ready to install the flywheel, and I've used a wood clamp to brace the engine tight to the workbench, because when I tighten up the crankshaft bolts, they're going to be 90 foot-pounds, and I don't want the engine to roll over when I put that much torque on it. To prepare the guide ring, I put a new O-ring in the groove, and then I put a little engine oil on it. And then on the outside, I want to make sure that's nice and clean and there's no oil on it. So I use some alcohol wipes and wipe it down and make sure it's not oily. Now the rear main seal has a Teflon lip, so I also use some alcohol wipes, and I work my way around that just to clean it, make sure there's no oil on it or debris. And then it's prepared for installation of the guide ring and the flywheel. So I'm going to put the guide ring on the crankshaft nose, and these are the 2 punch marks. And I also put a little white paint dot on the crankshaft nose, which has 2 punch marks. I'm just going to line those up, and then when I put the flywheel on, I'll line up the punch marks on the flywheel with the punch marks here. Now I'm using new flywheel bolts, and then there's the little cover plate, so I'm going to put a bolt through the plate, and then I'm going to put that bolt in the hole with the 2 punch marks, and then that's going to go into the hole that's got the guide ring, 2 punch marks. That way I'll have everything lined up correctly. So I have the guide ring and the 5 bolts and the little circle, and I'm just going to walk my way around to seat the guide ring on the crankshaft nose before I go torque it. By the way, there are some instructions from BMW about oiling these bolts before you put them in, but I have taken the advice of several people who are very knowledgeable mechanics, and I install them dry, and then I'll torque them to the BMW specification 90 foot-pounds. Now I've tightened these all up to pull the guide ring all the way down onto the crankshaft, and then I've loosened them a little bit, because you'll notice I can jiggle the flywheel back and forth on the bolts because the flywheel hole is a little bit bigger than the bolt. Now the orientation of the flywheel to the crankshaft directly affects ignition timing. And so you can be as much as a degree or more out on your timing if you don't get the flywheel centered on the bolt holes. So to center the flywheel, I position one of the teeth so that when I push it in one direction, the edge of the tooth is even with this casting. And when I pull it back, you'll notice it almost moves the full width of a tooth. So what I'll do is I'll get it so it's about halfway across the tooth, and then I'll tighten the bolts up on the flywheel. And that way it'll be centered on its bolts, and the timing on the engine will be spot on. Now I've used a big screwdriver in the teeth of the flywheel to block it, so when I torque the bolts, the flywheel's not going to move. Now I'm going to tighten them in some stages, so they're going up to 40 foot-pounds initially, and then I'll take it to 80 and then final 90. Okay, taking it up to 90 now. Okay, let's just check. All right, the flywheel's installed.